Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our Friday weekend edition. First hour here, I'm going to carry on without some of our roundtable guests who will join us at 1 o'clock. Jeremy Dice will be with us. Keisha Russell will be with us, and we'll be getting into the issue of impeachment, about the record number of judicial appointments that have now been confirmed in the Senate for Donald Trump, and that is certainly a very significant issue. We'll talk about why socialism became popular, and that is something that we will get into, as well as a piece that I've not posted, but maybe we will in the future, if for no other reason, because there's a book associated with it. Jarrett Stepman, who is, of course, an individual that works with the Heritage Foundation, has a book called The War on History, The Conspiracy to Rewrite America's Past. Maybe I'll buy a copy of the book first and decide if we want to get him on, but I'm going to be quoting from him anyway a little bit later to make that case. But kind of the lead story, I wouldn't have made it the lead story, but okay, we'll follow the mainstream press for a minute, is the decision by the individual who, of course, is well known in Democratic circles, and that is Mayor Bloomberg, who has decided that maybe indeed he is going to run for the presidency. Now, if you think about this, Michael Bloomberg has got a lot of things to deal with. Issue number one, almost all the other candidates have ground games going. That is, if you're Elizabeth Warren, if you're Bernie Sanders, if you are Joe Biden, you have individuals that are on the ground in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada, a lot of those, and certainly then you get to Super Tuesday all over the country. And so they have that already. Most likely some have it better than others. Some have more money than others. But even Mayor Pete probably has people designated in almost every one of the key states already. Michael Bloomberg does not have that. But he does have something a lot of the other people do not have: money. And that is significant because you might remember, now you have to go back about almost 8 years, that originally then candidate Barack Obama said he was going to take matching funds from the government until he realized he could raise enough without it. And that is, if you can fund your campaign with various donations, or self-fund your campaign because you're a billionaire, then you are not tied to certain campaign spending limits. And so that is certainly something that is in his favor. There's a couple of other things that are going to be challenges. Not only does he not have a ground game, he was a Republican. That might be enough right there to write you off. Or other people just might say, look, you've made some really bad decisions as mayor, and so that doesn't work very well. So, yeah, I mean, you can go on and on and on playing it back and forth, whether, as a businessman, that works against him, whether it works for him. But the fact is that he is even talking about it, and that people are talking about this. Suggest, as the articles that have come out suggest, two things. First of all, what many people in the Associated Press have written, the glaring weakness of establishment favorite Joe Biden, and the persistent fears that the surging rival, I probably should say, Elizabeth Warren is too liberal to defeat President Donald Trump. And so if you are a Democrat and you're not just really radical, and you're saying, I'm not sure a socialist like Bernie Sanders, or a person who doesn't call herself a socialist but basically is a socialist on most of her policies, Elizabeth Warren, is just too liberal, you might say, I would have liked Joe Biden, but he's damaged goods. So maybe Bloomberg works out that way. And if Michael Bloomberg begins to get some traction, you can begin to say that he might be around for a while. I think it's unlikely, but it is interesting that historically, especially on the Democratic Party side, I'm not saying it didn't happen on the Republican side, but especially on the Democratic side, whoever had more money won. I mean, just as simple as that. And then all of a sudden you had 2004. And then all of a sudden you had individuals that, like Howard Dean, that had more money than anybody else who lost. And then, of course, you go a few years later, and it's very clear that Hillary Clinton certainly had more money at the time than Barack Obama, and she lost. So sometimes in the Democratic primary, money, which is the mother's milk of campaigns, is important, but it isn't always necessarily a given that a person that can throw lots of money at a campaign could win. But if Michael Bloomberg wants to literally pepper all of the media outlets in Iowa, in New Hampshire, in South Carolina, and then certainly during Super Tuesday, he might get a lot of traction simply because of that being the case. And there may be some Democrats that say because somebody has this much money, he can run a campaign against Donald Trump in a way that others cannot, because he could literally fill the airwaves come the general election with all sorts of anti-Trump kinds of messages, too. So we will see. His other advantage is even if he is a Republican, he does check most of the boxes on everything from gun control all the way down, but he isn't as radical as Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or some of the others. So we'll see where that goes, but I thought we would mention it today, and we'll get into it in the future. Which is interesting because one of the articles we've posted today by Victor Davis Hanson, I mentioned it yesterday if you happen to be listening, Why Has Socialism Become Popular? And he kind of has 4 points, and some of those have to do with the fact that we have a lot of people in this country that were born in other countries and have come to expect a kind of a statist government. He also points out that there are people even in Silicon Valley and others that maybe because of feeling rich and guilty feel that maybe we need to redistribute income. But, of course, some of the most significant has to do with what's happening on our college campuses, where socialism is presented in a positive way and capitalism is attacked all the time. And, of course, if you have all sorts of outstanding student loan debts, you think, well, the capitalist system certainly has failed me. And then, of course, he also goes on to say that sometimes Republicans haven't been very good at giving a message because they've supported free trade but not fair trade. And so with all of that, it brings me to the Jarrett Stepman piece, which will start right now, and then I'll get into after the break. But we have some of these surveys, which we talked about just the other day with David Limbaugh. 70% of millennials responded in one of these surveys that they were likely or extremely likely to vote for a socialist. About 50% said they had an unfavorable view of capitalism. I'll come back and give you some more numbers, but I think just taking those two statistics illustrates exactly what David Limbaugh was trying to say on the program. It isn't just that they have a favorable view of socialism. It is also that capitalism, free market, has been run into the ground time and time again. And if you look at what were some of the most outstanding books that have been used over the years by various professors in colleges, and even some of them used in high schools where they teach government or civics or something like that, these oftentimes have a credible bias against capitalism and spend time talking about some real abuses like the robber barons and those kinds of things, focusing a lot on the issue of income inequality, which I'll get to a little bit later this hour as well. But nevertheless, that is the case. And then when you add to it, as we'll talk about when we come back from the break, many of these individuals, especially those who are the younger Generation Y or Generation Z, have no memory of the Soviet Union. And when you get into this, the argument Jarrett Stepman is making, the next generation of Americans will embrace socialism if we lose the war on history, because so much revisionist history has caused them to know very little about the benefits of a free market, and in many cases think it is evil. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, when the Apostle Paul made it to Athens, he was able to present the gospel to the Greek philosophers in a place known as the Areopagus. The Romans referred to it as Mars Hill. It was a place where various perspectives and ideas could be expressed, and today we call it the marketplace of ideas. Now, when I was in Athens, I was struck by the fact that you could see the Parthenon from this adjacent hill where Paul spoke to these philosophers about the unknown God. In fact, there's a plaque affixed to the hill that actually contains Paul's message in Greek for all to read and consider. Centuries later, John Milton gave a famous speech known as the Areopagitica, in which he defended the right of freedom of speech and expression. Those principles formed the basis for the modern justifications for free speech and marketplace, where various ideas and ideas can be expressed. The name of the speech was derived from the place where the Apostle Paul preached, as recorded in Acts 17. Following Milton were philosophers like John Locke and John Stuart Mill, who expressed the idea of a marketplace of ideas. They understood that truth could only be discovered if all views and opinions were considered. They rejected the idea of censoring viewpoints and banning topics and perspectives from an open, robust discussion. So why the brief history lesson? Well, I do so to remind us of the long and valuable tradition of a marketplace of ideas. That is not what you find on very many college campuses today. That is not what you find in some of the social media platforms. The academic elite and the media elite are quick to censor divergent views, especially Christian views. I think it is time for them to go back and learn the history of providing a marketplace of ideas. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Again, back to this very interesting article by Jarrett Stepman, which is a very good parallel to the one we have posted by Victor Davis Hanson, pointing out that, as I said, 70% of millennials said they were likely or extremely likely to vote for a socialist. 50% said they had an unfavorable view of capitalism. Now, part of the argument that Jarrett Stepman is making, and it's also an argument in the article I've posted by Victor Davis Hanson, simply is if you don't know much about history, then you come to some conclusions that are just factually incorrect. And one of those is just this idea that we don't really know much about the Soviet Union. For example, one of the polls found that 66%, or basically... No, 76%, so it was even more than that. It was 3/4, not 2/3, are unaware that the Hitler-Stalin pact started World War II. The Soviets, of course, began World War II as an ally of Hitler and only switched sides, if you will, when the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union. So you can see that, first of all, they don't know what started World War II. Then 57% of millennials believe the Declaration of Independence better guarantees freedom and equality over the Communist Manifesto. So, again, that is just amazing to me that you could only get a bare majority. To put that in perspective, the oldest generation, the so-called builder generation or silent generation, that was 94%. So you can see that there is a tremendous amount of slippage, which is one of the reasons why Jarrett Stepman says, as I explained in my new book, The War on History, The Conspiracy to Rewrite America's Past, there's not only been a worrisome decline in inculcating informed patriotism in young Americans, but a willful attempt to re-educate them and turn them against the foundations of America itself. And so if you want to understand one of the reasons why Marlon Maddox and now I and other hosts over the years on this program, hosts or guest hosts, have really wanted to talk about what's going on in the classroom, is we've come to realize that that's where, in some respects, some of the damage is being done. And so it's certainly important to understand that as well. One of the things that I thought was interesting is a little bit later, he talks about one of the individuals that was a former intern for the Heritage Foundation, that is Ricardo Pita. He's now a student at the University of Miami School of Law, but nevertheless, he was a former intern for the Heritage Foundation, and he grew up in Venezuela and explained in an interview with the Daily Signal in May how socialism made his country the disaster it is today. He says, what we try to tell others, having lived under a socialist regime, is that they sell it as a gamble. It's a gimmick. They will tell you this nebulous word of socialism. They promise you the moon, and then it never comes around. So again, part of the problem that we are dealing with is the fact that if you just paid attention to some of this, you would recognize that socialism has been quite a disaster. And one of those examples can be back at Victor Davis Hanson's piece, because he points out that let's just start looking at some of those countries. He says Russia and China are still struggling with the legacy of genocidal communism. Eastern Europe still suffers after decades of Soviet-imposed socialist chaos. Then you have countries like, we just mentioned, Cuba, Nicaragua, North Korea, Venezuela, and others, which are unfree, are poor, and are basically failed states. Then you have Baathism, he says, a synonym for pan-Arabic socialism, which has ruined the Middle East. And then you have the so-called soft socialism of many of the European countries who are economically stagnant and totally dependent, essentially, on the U.S. military for their protection, because what they've been able to do is maybe provide some of those benefits in the various welfare programs, but they've only been able to do that because they have done essentially very little, if anything, to protect their country and are totally dependent on the United States to protect them. So those are all really key issues. And so with that as a background, you'd say, okay, why is it so many people embrace socialism? And why is it that it looks like right now a individual that probably does embody socialist ideas has already done pretty well in terms of the run-up to the actual vote? It's important to recognize that nobody's actually voted yet. No caucus votes taken place, no primary votes taken place, but the odds-on favorite right now is Elizabeth Warren. And this came out just the other day, how Warren wooed the white left. And the point the writer is making is that most people, when this primary season began, felt, and I think rightly believed, that former Vice President Joe Biden was the odds-on favorite. He was in the lead. But interestingly enough, this author, Peter Spolankos, actually goes on to say that that is only part of the explanation, because in some respects, Joe Biden was doing well because he was attracting what you might call moderates in the Democratic Party, as well as African Americans. And interestingly enough, if you go back and look at some of these early primaries and caucuses, those are lots of times really dominated by individuals that have been put into the category of college-educated white liberals. And that was a constituency that Elizabeth Warren went after. It's obviously one that Beto O'Rourke went after, and it was one that Kamala Harris went after. But now in this article begins to explain really how some of this played out, because even though they are necessarily significant overall, they're very significant in both Iowa and New Hampshire. And so you might say, well, then that should have been good news for all three of those candidates. Well, then he begins to help us understand that many of us originally thought that Kamala Harris might actually have been the nominee because, number one, she would attract those white, liberal, college-educated, and because she was a senator from California, and now because California actually has a primary during Super Tuesday, she would certainly poll well. But as this article points out, even though she did well in one of the debates, in between the debates, they began to recognize that some of the positions she held to were polling badly. And so they began to, first of all, her and her staffers, as this article said, weaseled on this idea of abolishing private health insurance. The author went on to say what Harris didn't understand was that for ideological white liberals, abolishing private health insurance is a character issue. It wasn't about the candidate actually hunting down every last private health insurance policy if she would become president. It was about not preemptively surrendering during the primary. It was about showing guts when you were attacked. It was about showing leftist voters you would fight for them. Harris not only preemptively surrendered, but she did so in a way that everyone on every side recognized as cynical. Then when there was an attack from Tulsi Gabbard, that was it. He goes on to spend some time talking about Beto O'Rourke, but I'm going to ignore that for just a minute because I think we all recognize how he wilted under some of the criticism from Julian Castro, how he began to take more and more desperate positions in wanting to not only take away your AR-15s, but also take away your tax exemptions. And after a while, it began to be a caricature issue. And so then the last point that we're going to make is Elizabeth Warren, this author says, pursued a much more consistent strategy than Harris or O'Rourke. Like Harris, she staked out left-wing positions early, but unlike Harris, she stuck to them. When she was attacked as unrealistic or radical by lesser-known moderate candidates such as Don Delaney, she struck back fiercely. She earned the support of her college-educated liberal base, not only by agreeing with them, but by being seen as fighting for them. My prediction, and my predictions can be wrong because we honestly thought that Kamala Harris would do better, is that I think Elizabeth Warren will do well in Iowa, and she will do well in New Hampshire. And then the only question is what happens after that? By that time, we might be talking about a Michael Bloomberg. We might be talking about a Mayor Pete. We might talk about the possibility that a Bernie Sanders is still hanging along or a Joe Biden is still hanging along. So you never know. But the reality is that if you had to guess today, Elizabeth Warren has staked out a very difficult position to defend. If you listen to a conversation yesterday, we pointed out that spending $2 trillion every year, which is essentially two-thirds of the revenue that comes into the federal government on Medicare for All, is very unrealistic. And yet, nevertheless, she only occasionally gets challenged by some of her Democratic opponents. And because she's been so courageous, I think there are some that will say, look, she's staking this position out. We know we might not get everything, but we appreciate her courage. She is affable. She is a socialist without the socialist label. She's a woman, so that makes her a victim. And that is a whole lot better than putting another white male up on the platform debating Donald Trump. So we'll see where it goes. It is always difficult to figure out what the voters in any primary, Republican or Democrat, will do, but they are the ones that are going to determine who indeed will run against Donald Trump. When we come back, we have a couple of other issues to get into the topic list, and so we will certainly do that. I would encourage you to go to the website today, especially this article by Victor Davis Hanson. If you have socialists in your family, maybe this helps explain why they believe in socialism. We'll be right back.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dice would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention that one of the things we make available to you on a regular basis are our Viewpoints commentaries. And as a matter of fact, today we have both posted the one that Penna Dexter's will land on your website or in your inbox tomorrow. So if you've already signed up, ignore what I'm going to say. But if you have not, it's still amazing to me how many people have never signed up for our Viewpoints commentary. We were at an event the other day, and people uniformly signed up for it. And I thought, well, I hope you will do so. My commentary today is on the marketplace of ideas. Interestingly enough, it has a picture of Mars Hill, which I've actually spoken at before in Athens, and that is kind of the idea of a marketplace of ideas that was expressed even in the scriptures and even in Greek culture, and yet today there is a real attempt to try to censor those ideas. But one of the commentaries I have coming out next week, and this is one of the reasons why I might encourage you to sign up, is I try to dig into some of the data. There are so many times when we on Point of View are trying to talk about an issue that is really important, but it either is not covered by the mainstream press or poorly covered. And sometimes it may be out of bias, sometimes it's just out of ignorance. And one of the themes that's going to run through the campaigns is the idea of income inequality. Now, at the outset, let me just say that sometimes inequality is a good idea because it means there's freedom. If indeed you and I start out with $100 in our pocket, and then we say, okay, go out there and spend it in the wisest way or invest it in the wisest way, some of you are going to do better with that $100 than I am. I may do better than other people that way. As soon as you allow any kind of freedom, then you are going to get paid much better as an NBA center than you are getting paid as a public school teacher. So that's just reality. And actually, income inequality sometimes helps because people that are very wealthy, yeah, a lot of them spend it on themselves, a lot of them sit on it, but most of them invest it. And when they invest it, that creates jobs. As a matter of fact, as you've heard many people say over the years, I never got a job from a poor person. Always got it from somebody that had a little bit more money than I did, oftentimes a lot more. So first of all, income inequality is not necessarily bad. And if you really start doing an apples-to-apples comparison, the income inequality that you hear about on the campaign trail is poorly represented. And that's one of the reasons why my commentary coming out next week is about this issue, because a few people that know a whole lot more about this issue than you and me, I actually have dug into the numbers. One of those is former Senator Phil Gramm. I always felt good when Phil Gramm was in office because he, along with Dick Armey, were professors of economics. It's always nice to have a professor of economics that understands free market, understands economic issues, dealing with very important pieces of legislation. And he co-authored with former Commissioner John Early a thing which actually appeared, and you can read it for yourself, The Truth About Income Inequality. But what he does is he says that when we see people quoting these statistics, they are quoting the numbers from the Census Bureau. Nothing wrong with that. That's where we get a lot of our data. But he points out, and they point out, that the Census Bureau data fails to account for two very important things. Number one, the richest people in America pay 2/3 of the federal, state, and local taxes. So they conclude that ignoring the earned income lost to taxes substantially overstates their inequality. If you look at what they make and compare that to what people are on the lowest, you're going to artificially inflate that, because imagine that if you are in the highest tax bracket, half of that income isn't in your hands. So the better apples to apples comparison would be how much money do you get after taxes? Okay, so that's, I think, a very important factor to look at. But there's a second one, and the second one is that the Census Bureau data also fails to account for the fact that we spent almost $2 trillion. The actual number is $1.9 trillion on transfer payments to American households. These come from 95 different federal programs, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and all the rest. And so they say leaving out taxes and then these transfer payments that put money in the hands of individuals overstates inequality in America by more than 300%. So the inequality that you hear out of the mouths, and you will hear out of these various Democratic candidates, is artificially inflated because it doesn't really look at the numbers. One other thing hit me kind of interestingly, and that is they talk about these idea of quintiles. Quintiles are if you take all of the taxpayers and break them into fifths, okay? The people on the bottom quintile, so these would be the poorest of the poor. Interestingly enough, the average person there receives $45,000 in government transfers and then an additional $3,000 usually from private transfers. These come from charitable organizations, family sources, and the rest. So if you add all of that up and add in a couple of other details, it ends up being about $50,000. Looking at this, it looks like it's only about $49,000, but there's some other rounding error issues. So basically $50,000, almost $51,000, which means when you see people that are saying they're living at poverty, when you add in all the transfers to them, they are very close to the median family income, because median family income used to be about $50,000. A little bit higher now, but it illustrates again that we're not minimizing the difficulty of being poor at all. But still, it has been said on more than one occasion by various experts that we've even had on this program that, interestingly enough, the poor sometimes in America do better than the middle class in Asia, Europe, and a variety of other places. So again, I'm not minimizing some of the difficulties of living in an impoverished community and sometimes the lack of upward mobility. But those numbers are pretty striking when you begin to look at this. And if you travel overseas, as I have recently, when we've gone to Israel and we've gone to Rome, and you go through some of these ruins, you realize that the poorest person in America, probably even some of the poorest people in at least a developed country, live better than the richest person there. I mean, we take for granted electricity, air conditioning, television, phones, indoor plumbing, all sorts of health, vaccinations, and all the rest. I mean, the richest, most affluent people in the first century lived a lifestyle that is far below what even some of the poorest people in the United States live through right now. So it's something to think about. Well, we're talking about economics, and I'm going to jump on to some other issues. I did mention this the other day, but another one of the commentaries that will be coming out is on the issue of tax exemption. Of course, Beto O'Rourke is no longer running. He's not a presidential candidate. But his argument, which he made, was made in large part because, guess what? There are a lot of other people that believe that as well. That if anything, those of you that are in churches or Christian organizations, because you get a tax exemption, you're really sort of getting a free ride. And what I do in the column is take you through some of the impact that these institutions actually make. For example, the economic impact of faith is considered to be about $1.2 trillion. And more importantly, a study that was done by Rodney Stark. We mentioned him just the other day. Matter of fact, when we were talking with Robert Hutchison yesterday, and I think I even mentioned him in passing when we were talking about him with David Limbaugh, his study at Baylor and others tried to estimate how much have federal sources, state and local sources benefited, how much of these various groups have benefited because we have religious organizations, churches and Christian groups, actually doing something to, in a sense, provide a social safety net so that the government doesn't have to spend your tax dollars. And the best estimate, and I think it's a reasonable one, matter of fact, it may be a little too conservative, is that each year religious organizations save the government $2.67 trillion in social services. And, of course, it gets back to the thought experiment I've used before. Imagine, as one author suggested, that Christian institutions decided to go on strike. And all of a sudden, you didn't have Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist hospitals. You didn't have Christian schools. You didn't have soup kitchens. You didn't have outreach to the poor. You didn't have refugee services and all the kinds of things that Christian groups and churches do. That would be devastating, because we depend in a large part on those institutions, and they make all the difference in the world. And so I think sometimes it would be good to have a debate about tax exemption, because it would then, I think, focus a couple of very important issues on the table. First of all, why do certain institutions have a 501c3? The NFL, the National Football League, is a 501c3 tax-exempt organization. How did that happen? I'd like to know that. Why would the ACLU get this, since there is no demonstrable benefit that we get from them compared to some of these soup kitchens? I mean, I know that nothing probably would change, but it would help people that are sometimes atheistic and skeptical to really recognize that if you want to talk about the abuse of the tax-exempt status, I can point you to some directions, and most of them are not religious organizations, because most of those religious organizations are doing a lot of good. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover. We will do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, when the Apostle Paul made it to Athens, he was able to present the gospel to the Greek philosophers in a place known as the Areopagus. The Romans referred to it as Mars Hill. It was a place where various perspectives and ideas could be expressed, and today we call it the marketplace of ideas. Now, when I was in Athens, I was struck by the fact that you could see the Parthenon from this adjacent hill where Paul spoke to these philosophers about the unknown God. In fact, there's a plaque affixed to the hill that actually contains Paul's message in Greek for all to read and consider. Centuries later, John Milton gave a famous speech known as the Areopagitica, in which he defended the right of freedom of speech and expression. Those principles formed the basis for the modern justifications for free speech and marketplace, where various ideas and ideas can be expressed. The name of the speech was derived from the place where the Apostle Paul preached, as recorded in Acts 17. Following Milton were philosophers like John Locke and John Stuart Mill, who expressed the idea of a marketplace of ideas. They understood that truth could only be discovered if all views and opinions were considered. They rejected the idea of censoring viewpoints and banning topics and perspectives from an open, robust discussion. So why the brief history lesson? Well, I do so to remind us of the long and valuable tradition of a marketplace of ideas. That is not what you find on very many college campuses today. That is not what you find in some of the social media platforms. The academic elite and the media elite are quick to censor divergent views, especially Christian views. I think it is time for them to go back and learn the history of providing a marketplace of ideas. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, I thought I would mention one other issue that may surface in the campaign, and this comes from Bloomberg, not Michael Bloomberg, but the Bloomberg News Agency. Earth needs fewer people to beat the climate crisis. And, of course, this reminds me of Jonathan Swift, The Modest Proposal. Reminds me of that woman that was screaming that day, "We need to eat the babies." Now, of course, that was just a satirical attempt at all of that. But, unfortunately, there are a lot of people that are very serious about this, and it's starting to surface with this idea of the Green New Deal. It's starting to surface as we see younger and younger individuals who've really bought into the fact that we're in the midst of a huge climate crisis, that we need to do something, and what we need to do is make sure we have fewer children. Now, many years ago, when I was at graduate school at Yale, had a professor who only found out later actually was one of the founders of Zero Population Growth, ZPG. Well, in many cases, we don't have zero population growth. We have negative population growth in many parts of the world. Australia, Europe. I mean, it's really pretty much getting that way even in the United States. If you recognize that you need 2.1 children to replace the population and your fertility rate is 1.7, you are basically moving to, maybe you haven't reached it yet, but you're moving to negative population growth. If you go to Greece, a number of years ago, we went to both Israel and Greece. It was just great to see Corinth and Athens and Philippi and things like that. When you recognize they have a fertility rate of 1.1, you have a situation where you have more grandparents than parents and more parents than kids. And it's just collapsing on itself. But back to the key point. This article says that 40 years ago, scientists from 50 nations converged on Geneva to discuss what they called the CO2 climate problem. And I do remember when that conversation was taking place. And they were concerned that reliance on fossil fuels really helped trigger the 1979 oil crisis. They predicted that global warming would eventually become an environmental challenge. So they got to work trying to figure out how to develop that. They put together what is now known as IPCC. It's the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, and that really brought a lot of that together. But now, 4 decades later, says this article, a larger group of scientists is sounding another much more urgent alarm. These experts from around the world are calling for a critical addition to the main strategy of dumping fossil fuels for renewable energy. They need to have far fewer humans on the planet. And so that's kind of the argument that is being made right now, that we, if nothing else, need to do what we can to reduce the size of families. We need to maybe be even more aggressive in terms of abortion and birth control. And so you're going to see, in a sense, kind of two almost bifurcated views. One view, certainly, that comes in the secular world, that children are a burden, children are not an asset, children are a liability. And on the other hand, you're going to see those that are going to say, no, wait a minute, the Bible says children are a blessing. We should have children. Families are important, and we should go the other direction. Which leads me to one other commentary that you have a chance to sign up for next week, and that is one by Marco Rubio, because his argument is simply this, that strong families are the foundation of a strong nation. That's sort of intuitively obvious. All the way from Michael Novak, who won awards for writing those kinds of things, to Senator Ben Sasse, who's been on the program. Of course, now Marco Rubio joins that conversation. And he says, unfortunately for a lot of Americans, marriage now resembles what he calls a luxury good, which keeps them from having stable families and keeps them from really even forming in the first place. And then he points out that there's really an incredible gap between the more affluent and the working class, because it used to be that both working class individuals and affluent individuals actually had children living in an environment with both biological parents. That's changed dramatically. Charles Murray's been on the program with us before. His book, Coming Apart, points out that about 85% of affluent families still have two-parent biological parents raising kids, but only 30% of working-class families. And if you're not familiar with this, almost every sociological study points out that an unstable home often leads to worse outcomes later in life. Doesn't mean it always happens. I mean, the example I always love to use is you look at the difficult family experience of Ben Carson, but he was very successful. And I can point to many other individuals, some of whom are serving in the cabinet, some of whom are outstanding individuals in our community that grew up in broken homes. But the harsh reality is that oftentimes if you go back to those who are incarcerated, those who have difficulties, it goes back to having a family that was in one way or another, oftentimes in many ways, very dysfunctional. He then goes on, Marco Rubio goes on to find out and point out that childhood is very different as well, because we used to have these sort of cornerstone institutions. For the boys, it might have been Boy Scouts, or girls, it might have been Girl Scouts, or it could have been in the churches Awana programs. It could have been could have been different sports programs. There are all sorts of things. But he points out, again, quoting from Marco Rubio, a generation of children for these individuals experience relationships were built through strong community bonds. That's no longer the case. And he says the void has oftentimes been filled with social media, which he says spawns online bullying, widespread mental health issues, and countless hours formerly spent socializing, now which are spent alone. So he recognizes that, first of all, you don't solve this with any kind of government program. He has worked, of course, to expand the federal per-child tax credit, but at the same time, he recognizes oftentimes politics and government policies only can treat the symptoms, not the problem. He says he understands that no law can force someone to be a better parent or a spouse. So again, the ultimate solutions to some of those are going to take place pretty obviously in the social and the cultural and religious realm. That's why I think, if nothing else, we need to work to make sure we're promoting a pro-life, pro-family agenda and really talk about the importance of family. And that has always been the case, but especially now when you're having more and more of these climate scientists saying, we just simply can't have families. We simply cannot have families with more than one child, if any. We really need to recognize that we have too many people on this planet. And so the reason we need to cut back and have aggressive programs on birth control and abortion and everything else is because the earth needs fewer people if we're going to beat this challenge of climate change. So you're going to have two very different messages being presented here in the 21st century. And I thought I'd just try to fairly present both of those. But a lot of the comments being made by some of these scientists go all the way back to Jonathan Swift, A Modest Proposal. And if you're not familiar with that, take a minute, get out on the computer, type on Wikipedia, and you'll see that this was an attempt to really sort of make fun of this sort of Malthusian idea that we have too many people and the population is going to destroy the planet. Those kinds of ideas, even though presented centuries ago, are live and well here in the 21st century. So if you find yourself saying, okay, I'd like to read a little bit more about this first, again, don't forget that we provide a lot of that information on our website, pointofview.net. Already I've mentioned one article on socialism. We have a video called The Korean Lights. That is something you might want to show to a young person to help them see the difference between North Korea in the dark and South Korea in the light. It's not only an economic difference, it's also a spiritual difference as well. And a little bit later, we'll get into one of the other court battles that Penedexter writes about, the Little Sisters of the Poor. Seems like every time we turn around, they're being sued again. And we talked just the other day about some of that with a friend that was with the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. So we're going to spend some time talking about that as well. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, Jeremy Dice, Keisha Russell will be with us, and we will convene our conversation on our weekend edition. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today. Here it is our weekend edition, and we are privileged to have a couple of guests around the round table. Jeremy Dice, who's Senior Counsel for First Liberty, Keisha Russell, who's Associate Counsel, and it's just great to have you both here because we're going to be talking about a lot of legal issues. But just before we get to that, let me just mention in passing, and we'll probably get into this later in the next hour, Michael Bloomberg is talking about actually running, and that might be, I think, an indication that maybe Joe Biden's campaign isn't doing so well, and maybe Elizabeth Warren might be perceived as too liberal. And of course, the positive that he has is money. The negatives could be a lot of things, like there's 90 days before the first vote. He is a former Republican. That might be seen as a negative, and whether or not he's got enough political experience. And also, how about a ground game? I mean, every other candidate, whether it's Mayor Pete, whether it's Joe Biden, whether it's Elizabeth Warren, whether it's Bernie Sanders, whoever it is, they probably have various individuals on the ground in Iowa, in North Dakota, and in New Hampshire, and in South Carolina, and in Nevada. And, of course, during a lot of those Super Tuesday elections, don't think he has that either. But nevertheless, it's just something that I wanted to mention in passing.
How bored do you have to be to have $1 billion and decide to run for president?
Yes.
I mean, that's pretty incredible right there.
I know. That's $1,000 million, really, you know, just to give people an idea. $1 billion.
Mike, I got plans, man.
Yeah.
You want to have a good time? Let's go. We can spend a year just burning through that $1 billion together. We'll have a lot of fun.
And he probably will if he runs. So anyway, we do plan to get into the campaign a little bit, but I just thought for a few minutes I might hear from the two of you about the significance of what happened earlier in the week. Kelly Shackelford announced that he was going to be with the president, and he was, and I watched it on YouTube where the president was there with all sorts of Republican leaders announcing that you have, and I guess the numbers are 158 life-tenured federal judges. Actually, there's more since then, but I'm using those numbers there. 2 Supreme Court justices, 44 Circuit Court judges, and 112 District Court judges. Jeremy, let me come to you for just a minute. Some of these people that are being put on the Circuit Court or the District Court, you know these people personally. Some of them have worked with you. Some of them have done pro bono work for you.
Yeah, right. I mean, one of my colleagues, Matthew Kaczmarek, is on the bench in Amarillo right now, having spent 3 or 4 years working for us as well. We've got volunteer attorneys of ours like Jim Ho and others who are on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. These are people that have been laboring in the field for a long time on not just religious liberty issues, but a whole range of conservative thinking and thought and other legal issues. These are good people. Look, the takeaway from the 2016 election was very clear, especially within the evangelical niche of the voting populace right there. What was it, like 85%, I think, of evangelicals voted for the president solely because of the list of judges that he would appoint. It's a big deal to them. And not only is he fulfilling those, he's trying to do more. And he's not backing down on those that have, a little frustration here. I think there's a lot of folks that were worried that President Trump might actually kind of renege on that when he got into office, that he would be a little bit more milquetoasty, or perhaps that he would be not willing to put a whole big stance on conservative judges. He put a few more moderates in there. Boy, I tell you, there may be 1 or 2 outliers here and there, but over that 150, 170, wherever that number is right now, they're great judges that are up there, great justices, 2 of them sitting on the Supreme Court that are going to be there for 40, 50 years that the Lord gives them life. it's a good place to be in right now, and I have no reason for any of us to doubt that the future holds anything but a continuation of this continued trend.
Keisha, let me talk about that for just a minute because it'll make your job a lot easier. A lot of people only focus on the Supreme Court, and there's 2 there, but 112, and now I think it's up to 115 district court judges. That's where a lot of the battle takes place, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely, especially with what we do with religious liberty. It's really important to have judges that are going to interpret the law as it's written, especially the Constitution. And so we're really excited about what the president is doing with the judges, and hope it continues.
Let's see if we can talk about the fact that there were more coming through just this year than the previous 2 years, and that has to do with an attempt on the part of the Democrats to slow things down. I think I had a number here of the number of cloture votes that took place. The Democrats forced at one point 118 cloture votes. To put that in perspective, in the previous 5 presidents combined, there were only 7 cloture votes. And they had this idea of also having 30 hours of discussion. And that was even done when you were talking about Obama nominees. So a lot of it was an attempt to slow walk this. And that brings us back to the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell. He kind of changed some things, didn't he?
Well, yeah, that and Harry Reid, for that matter, too, who may be really kicking himself that he got rid of that nuclear option thing. Yeah. And I think the Democrats are really upset about that. Look, the slow walking thing is purposeful. When your strategy revolves around making up for what you can't do in the legislature by doing it in the courts, you're going to do everything you possibly can to protect that greater side of the Article 3 courts to make sure that you have access there. And so I think their strategy is just laid bare when they start slow walking these very qualified nominees, or worse, castigating them or examining them to unlawful religious tests. I think all of it goes together to say they can't lose the courts, because if they do, they can't win in the legislature. They haven't won in the presidency recently, and they can't win when it comes to the courts.
Well, one of the individuals that we want to encourage you to take action items on, and we mentioned this last week with Kelly, we posted it, Lawrence Van Dyke's confirmation. And we've also posted, thank you, Jeremy, for mentioning this article, which I was unaware of until you mentioned, Kelly Shackelford saying, I was interviewed by the ABA for Lawrence Van Dyke. This letter does not speak for me. Keisha, one of the things we've always used to, at least, I'm the old guy around the table, believe is the American Bar Association would be kind of nonpartisan, a lot more objective. That seems to have flown out the window.
It's a shame, but it definitely has flown out the window. I think their comments on Lawrence Van Dyke were just outrageous, that they would make those kinds of allegations about his character and his integrity and not really comment on the fact that he's a very accomplished lawyer. I think that just, siding with a particular, viewpoint about, his character, I think it doesn't help the discussion on judicial nominations, and it doesn't give him a fair shot as demonstrate to the public that he is qualified for the bench.
Yeah, because I think he would be your classic qualified individual. He's been in Nevada, in Montana. He's clerked for some really important individuals. He's not a flamboyant kind of individual, and yet here, this is a good example of vilifying an individual. It reminded me a little bit of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings.
Oh, absolutely. That's the only playbook that they have, is to besmirch the character of the potential candidate. They don't look at his bona fides. They don't look at his legal writing and research ability. They don't look at any of those things. They just say he's not qualified. And this notion that this is personal to me, so that's why I'm worked up about this.
Okay.
But the notion that Lawrence Van Dyke would be unqualified, according to the ABA, is absurd. Number one, how on earth has the ABA managed to get this kind of monopoly hold on the clearinghouse for judges here? That's absurd. And what Kelly has said, and I think very well here, is that it's time for them to be treated like just about everybody else. Mm-hmm. That they're welcome to voice their opinion, but they should not have that stranglehold on there. That's right. And there's a lot more to be said about that. But it's frustrating to me that they go after his character and that they do so under the guise of some sort of special privileged status that they have that they probably shouldn't.
I might just mention we're going to continue talking about this after the break, but I like what Kelly says. The ABA has only hurt itself with this biased and personal attack against a brilliant lawyer and a good man. And we've given you an action item, so if you go to Point of View, we have a take action item. We'll talk more about what that means right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, when the Apostle Paul made it to Athens, he was able to present the gospel to the Greek philosophers in a place known as the Areopagus. The Romans referred to it as Mars Hill. It was a place where various perspectives and ideas could be expressed, and today we call it the marketplace of ideas. Now, when I was in Athens, I was struck by the fact that you could see the Parthenon from this adjacent hill where Paul spoke to these philosophers about the unknown God. In fact, there's a plaque affixed to the hill that actually contains Paul's message in Greek for all to read and consider. Centuries later, John Milton gave a famous speech known as the Areopagitica, in which he defended the right of freedom of speech and expression. Those principles formed the basis for the modern justifications for free speech and marketplace, where various ideas can be expressed. The name of the speech was derived from the place where the Apostle Paul preached, as recorded in Acts 17. Following Milton were philosophers like John Locke and John Stuart Mill, who expressed the idea of a marketplace of ideas. They understood that truth could only be discovered if all views and opinions were considered. They rejected the idea of censoring viewpoints and banning topics and perspectives from an open, robust discussion. So why the brief history lesson? Well, I do so to remind us of the long and valuable tradition of a marketplace of ideas. That is not what you find on very many college campuses today. That is not what you find in some of the social media platforms. The academic elite and the media elite are quick to censor divergent views, especially Christian views. I think it is time for them to go back and learn the history of providing a marketplace of ideas. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, it is our weekend edition, and Jeremy Dice and Keisha Russell with us. And if you go to our website right now, pointofview.net, the middle column there says Take Action. Lawrence Van Dyke's confirmation, contact Senate switchboard. And we've given you the number 202-224-3121. I'll give it again in case you don't happen to have access to a computer, but we are convinced that this is a very significant case. And for just a minute, Keisha, let's talk about this, because after all, when you look through the material that we've also posted by Kelly, a very gifted lawyer, Harvard Law grad, if I remember right, top of his class just about. He was an individual that was writing for the Harvard Law Review, prestigious judicial clerkship, volunteered to really deal with some of the kind of cases we think about. I mean, this is an outstanding individual. Yet he's listed as what? Unqualified?
Yeah, I think it's really a shame. I mean, his credentials are stellar, and I think the ABA's job here is to provide an objective voice and view of his credentials and his ability to be an objective judge, and they have not provided that information. I think providing him with an evaluator that supported his opponent at some point during an election, I think is a good important demonstration that the ABA is not really trying to be objective. They're trying to be biased.
Yeah. If I give to your opponent and then I evaluate you, I don't know. I'm thinking that's a possibility for bias. What about that, Jeremy?
Yeah. I mean, look, this whole letter is a sham. I mean, that's all it can be described as. The premise of the letter is that we've discussed all these negative thoughts and feelings and positions that Lawrence Van Dyke has with all the interviewees that they had contacted. And they contacted supposedly about 60 of them across, I think they said 12 different states or something like that. And so the image that you receive from that is, hey, we've done a really thorough investigation of this guy, and he's bad. Get him off the judiciary. He cannot be there, that kind of thing. Well, what Kelly does really well in this article is to say, wait a minute, you may never have been through one of these processes. Let me tell you what it looks like, because they interviewed me. I was one of the interviews, he says, of Lawrence Van Dyke. They never discussed the negatives with me. Not once. He said he spent about a half an hour on the phone, 20 minutes to a half an hour on the phone with the interviewee, the former political rival of Lawrence. And they discussed all these things, all real positive things. In fact, he said that, it doesn't say this in the piece, but in talking to him, he says that it was a real positive conversation. She kind of seemed like, hey, this is really great news to hear. We got a good guy here kind of thing. Well, what comes out in the letter is that he's got all these negatives about his inability to prepare, his inability to actually then perform after he's prepared, his inability to actually employ the procedures correctly in the law.
Without basis for any of those allegations. No factual basis to support any of those allegations. Yeah.
Right, and including things about the LGBT community in there, that he somehow has an animus against them, which if you watched last week, you saw him be moved to tears about the fact that he would actually be accused of that kind of thing. It's absurd.
And not just accused, but say that he himself said that he would not be fair to that community. I think it's just absurd.
And that brought him to tears, didn't
it?
It's just
absurd.
Yeah.
It did, because as he said in his answer, he believes that all humans are deserving of dignity, the dignity given to them by their creator. And so he would absolutely treat everyone with the fairness that they require and deserve. But what Kelly then says is that, hey, look, if they had wanted to talk about his character, we should have done all about that. Because here's what I did. I did tell them about what he has done. Now, think about this. You got a guy who went to Harvard Law School, came out from Montana to go to Harvard Law School, graduates near the top of his class or at the top of his class, has his prestigious fellowship or a clerkship right after law school, and goes into a major powerhouse law firm. He could pick any case he wants to work on. Really, I mean, almost any case he wants to work on and make buku bucks doing it. My guess is he probably had student loans that would have done a good thing for him to be able to pay back, right? Every attorney in a firm has got to make billable hours in order to make partner at some point. So you better believe that Lawrence was very excited about billing hours so that his partnership would be on track. Well, what he chooses to do is to meet all those billable hour requirements, but then on top of all that, do a whole bunch of community service. And where does he do his community service? Well, he works with First Liberty Institute. We work together to defend the ACLU, oddly enough, and here in Texas to make sure that they could have it was a challenge to a speakership position here in the state of Texas legislature. Right. He then worked on one of our cases out in Mississippi. This is a fantastic case. I think we talked about before in Holly Springs, where there's an African-American church that was kept off the town square because they didn't fit the profile on the town square down there. Lawrence Van Dyke was the guy that argued all that. It was his first argument in his career, and he got that with First Liberty Institute. And guess what? He did it all pro bono. So you want to talk about having an opportunity to observe his preparation and then to see his performance? Kelly saw both of those things. They didn't bother to ask him about that. How about his character? Well, he's donating his time to the ACLU and this African-American church in Holly Springs, Mississippi. I think he's got a lot of character. And what Kelly says is that character, I can summarize it in one word, he says, sacrificial. He's giving up his time, he's giving up his money, and he's giving towards his passion, and that is helping people like this Holly Springs church. It is just, I mean, I'm of course, I'm very worked up. Lawrence is a friend of mine as well, but it bothers me when my friends are dragged through the mud like this. Yeah. Yes. And not only that they're dragged through the mud, but they purposefully ignore the truth otherwise. And this lie, and it can be only described as a lie what this letter is, that says that they somehow discussed this with Kelly. They didn't discuss the negative views with Kelly or, from my knowledge, any of the other interviewees. And if they did, they didn't include these wonderful other things to counterbalance all that. They just had an ideological axe to grind, and they ground it down to the bone. And they look, the ABA is welcome to do that if they want to. If they want to demonstrate the partisan special interest group that they actually are, fine, go ahead and be that. But you don't get the special access that you get as a sort of neutral arbiter of what it makes a good judge anymore. And Kelly is right, and I think this is rather bold of Kelly at the end of this whole thing. He says, look, the Trump administration should not make a single other nominee available to the ABA.
That'd be good.
And those of you that are contacted by the ABA as an interviewee, you need to decline.
Yeah, Senator Howley, during the hearing, made that comment and said he would no longer consider the ABA's letters and his decisions regarding nominees.
And rightly so. I mean, if this is the kind of political stunt that they're going to pull, have them line up against everybody else. Look, every special interest group under the sun has some sort of perspective on a judge. We're asked our position on judges as well, and we give what we think we should say on those things. But we're not asking for special insight. We're not asking for special privilege status. The ABA has somehow managed to have that entire monopoly. And I mean, for one thing, they just are not a good representation of the legal community. I mean, it is a fast shrinking membership size there.
Right.
And almost all of them, I mean, the conservatives are leaving in droves right now because there's no place for them anymore. They are a liberal special interest group, and they really have no business having such an outweighted position to when it comes to judges anymore.
Let's, if we can, give our listeners an opportunity to participate. Now, of course, we did do this last week, and it has been posted for a week, but again, recognize some people tend to listen to the Friday program more than any other. And so we have some people that are just saying, well, I've never heard about Lawrence Van Dyke. First of all, we have that information on the website. So there's a take action item. You can call the Senate switchboard, 202-224-3121. If you say, well, I need a little bit of data, this piece here by Kelly Shackelford, and I know you wrote some of it as well, gives the information that you might need. And so I encourage you to make the phone call. Now, some of you that are in states like California saying, well, I know how my senators are going to vote. Okay, they still need to hear from you. But some of you, we just mentioned Holly a minute ago, some of you in Missouri might be good to say, well, thank you for standing up for him. Or if you're in Texas, thank you for standing up for him. Some of you might actually be in states where we'd like to make sure that people would vote for Lawrence Van Dyke, but sometimes they need just a little bit of strengthening of the spine. Have you noticed this before? Sometimes we have had a few, I'm thinking South Carolina, a few other places where maybe that phone call would be really important. So if they were on the phone, anybody give us an idea of what you would maybe say to the assistant to those United States senators?
Ignore the ABA
yes.
letter.
Yeah, I
Ignore
mean,
the ABA and confirm this man.
You have to understand this is a really important nomination because it's going to be on the Ninth Circuit, and that circuit has been, liberal for a long time. I think if you look at the Coach Kennedy's decision that came out of the Ninth Circuit, and then the NIFLA decision that came out of the Ninth Circuit, there's definitely a need on that circuit for, I'll just say, unbiased views on especially religious liberty. So I think this is a really important nominee, and I think the all of your listeners really need to contact those senators.
And look, he's a friend, and so take my words as both sincere, but also weighted by the fact that he's a personal friend of mine. Lawrence is a good man.
Yes,
he's about.
Seems like one.
And look, I'm a big man. I'm 6'3". I think he's like 6'8" or something. He's a big guy, but he's one of the most lovable little fuzzballs I've ever met. He's a very tender human being. And the reaction you saw of him crying at the judiciary, I'm going to give him all kinds of grief for that next time I see him. But, I mean, it's sincere because he would feel absolutely wretched for having that thought of him or accused that he actually would have said something like that. He genuinely believes that all human beings are deserving of dignity, not because they're just humans, but because the God who created them gave them that. And I think that is the kind of judge all of us want to have on any bench anywhere in the country, because he then understands that these rights are not something that came to us by man. They came to us by God, and he understands his place in that Chicago government.
So again, the action item is available for you on the website, pointofview.net. When we come back, we're going to talk about these conscience protections and some of the issues there. And could we have "In God We Trust" a decal on patrol cars? That's another issue we'll get to, and maybe even talk about those window clings you've made available in the past. So we've got a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Jeremy and Keisha with us today, and we are going to probably get into impeachment in just a few minutes, but I thought I'd take a few other religious liberty issues. One of those is the media's war on religious freedom by saying that a conscience protection is a so-called conscience protection. And, of course, we've had a couple of judges now rule that the rule from the Health and Human Services Department allowing doctors or other healthcare professionals to refuse to perform an abortion, assisted suicide, whatever, is a so-called religious freedom issue. And really, Jeremy, I'm getting to the point now where I remember a time when if you said I was doing religious liberty work, they put you in the same category as a civil rights lawyer, and you were lauded and seen as somebody doing something good. In a long period of time now, it's sort of so-called religious liberty. That's changed dramatically, hasn't it?
We're scare quoted everywhere we go these days.
I can't believe this.
It is remarkable that one of the core freedoms that undergirds our society is relegated to a scare quote status, right? Well, maybe it's not a real religious liberty; it's a quote religious liberty, right? Well, look, this rule is really emblematic of that. Think of in stark terms what they're fighting against here, right? The rule says that we're not going to allow employers to force doctors, nurses, and other health professionals from doing things within their medical practice that would violate their conscience, right? So they're not going to force a nurse to have to perform or participate in an abortion. They won't allow the employer to force a doctor to actually have to perform the abortion procedure, or perhaps a Catholic hospital from having to perform a hysterectomy on a transgendered man or woman, or however that works out, a woman who's trying to become a man. That's what's actually going on here. And so let me just kind of put it in more stark terms so we understand that. What they're saying, what the advocates against this are saying, is that doctors and nurses and medical professionals, health professionals around the country, they should be forced to violate their conscience.
That's right.
Right? They should be required. The nurse that objects to abortion should be required to hold the vacuum hose that sucks the baby out of the mom. Sorry, that's as stark as I can make it. The doctor who is against religiously, he has let's say he's a Catholic physician, and the Catholic Church has a very clear teaching when it comes to human sexuality. He can be required to perform a rather invasive surgery to remove the uterus of a woman and then reconfigure the genitalia that she was given to look more like a male's genitalia. I mean, that's what's being required under this. That's what they're advocating for. And all that the HHS rule here has done is to say, yeah, maybe we ought to be, as a polite society, saying that, okay, if you have a religious objection, you should be allowed to avoid all that. Well, why would that be a good idea? Because they, as well as Keisha and I and you, we understand that human beings have a duty above government. They have a duty that extends beyond this universe, and something that at least these religious adherents believe, and I do, that I have a responsibility to God. And if you go back to James Madison and read his memorial and remonstrance, he makes this abundantly clear to say that a duty that is before God is also one that is a duty before man. We have a duty to respect that responsibility that you have before God. And so that's why we have these protections in the law. That's why we have the First Amendment, for that matter, to make sure you have the space and freedom so that the government, in human terms, doesn't accidentally damage your ability to obey that duty, that responsibility before God. And so what the left here is doing, and the media is their willing friend here, is trying to somehow dumb that all down to say, no, God's not the ultimate responsibility you have. You have a responsibility to government, and he transcends the idea and the responsibility you might have to your church. That is absolutely wrong.
It absolutely is, and I think it doesn't surprise me at all that this is what's happening, because even 9 years later, we're still fighting over religious exemptions to the contraceptive mandate. We're still trying to get nuns to pay for contraception.
Celibate octogenarian nuns.
To pay for contraception. And you have
that's
right
Penna
now.
commentary today on
Right,
the Little Sisters battle.
That's right. You've got Pennsylvania and New Jersey telling the courts that the Trump administration should not be allowed to offer these religious exemptions because they don't want to pay for the contraception that they claim is so important for these women, who, by the way, they've not been able to name any woman who's going to be so-called harmed. Now, there's where you use quotations by these religious exemptions to these organizations.
Yeah, another one is when they say care. They say medical care. That one deserves that because they care when you have an abortion. We had Luke Goodrich on earlier this week. We were talking about Little Sisters of the Poor, and here we are again. Every time we turn around, they're being dragged through the court. And it gets to, Jeremy, a question that some Christians are starting to ask me, and that is, if I am a Christian who wants to act on my faith, could I even be a pharmacist? Could I be a doctor? Oh, by the way, could I be a florist or a baker or a
senator
t-shirt maker?
or a judge?
I mean, it's just unbelievable. If you take seriously biblical ideas, we're starting to have this kind of pushback from the secular side that just simply says if you have any deeply held religious belief, that will disqualify you from lots and lots of employment.
Well, they'd like to disqualify you from it all, but it may not be the way that you envision your career to go. But the good news is that we're winning these cases, right? We won the Little Sisters of the Poor case. We won Hobby Lobby, so business owners are safe. We won the Baker case with Jack Phillips, and we're working on another one with Aaron and Melissa Klein ourselves. We win these cases. You know how many cases we lose? 100% of the ones we never bring, right? And so if you're saddened about the fact that all these different individuals are losing their jobs or whatever, hey, it may come to you as that next pharmacist that has to challenge this legislation that violates your conscience. And if you don't bring that, guess what? You've just damaged all the other pharmacists right there, right?
Well said.
So
Well
it's
said.
a good opportunity for us to make sure. What was it Ronald Reagan reminds us of? I think I say this about every time I'm coming on the show, but it's a reminder that freedom is not something we pass down through the bloodstream. It's something that we have to recommit ourselves to every single generation, or we will lose it. And so that requires you and I actively transmitting those freedoms to our next generation, but during our own generation, doing what we can to preserve and defend them and take them back from government who's trying to remove them from us.
Well said. By the way, while you're mentioning those cases, Aaron and Melissa Klein, Coach Kennedy, don't those all go through the Ninth Circuit Court?
Oddly enough, that's right.
That gets back to Lawrence Van Dyke, doesn't it? So again, if people, this would make your job a lot easier too, if you have those kind of people on the court.
Well, it certainly would, and that's kind of why we're saying that even at the district court level, this is so important, because some of those cases Jeremy mentioned, we lost at the district court level.
Yes, you did.
Right? And so we have to go all the way up to the Supreme Court for them to say, no, this is actually the law, and this is how it should be applied. And so getting judges at the lower court to really say this is how the law should be applied would really kind of, help us out.
Yeah, before we get any Twitter people saying, well, actually, to Kerby on here, I'll do the actually for you. Aaron and Melissa are in the state court system in Oregon, so actually, no, they're not in the Ninth Circuit.
Not yet. Okay. Got you. And thank you for helping, because I've seen where it's going. I was already 2 steps ahead, which comes when you play chess, but that's not the way we do it here. I'm already thinking 2 steps because it's going to go from there to there. But anyway, let's talk about local for just one more minute, because Jeremy, you suggested this one too, and I've been familiar with this, but Florida Sheriff defends In God We Trust decal on patrol cars after atheists complain. No surprise that the Freedom from Religion Foundation had problems with In God We Trust decals, but we've talked about this before, and I'm glad that people in law enforcement recognize that they have a higher power, and that's called God.
Yeah, look, this is Keisha's baby. She sent the letter, so I'll let her address what we did with it all. But, the background on this is not occurring in a vacuum. We've had sheriffs and police chiefs all over the nation that have decided to add the national motto on their law enforcement vehicles, and these nasty grams are sent to them trying to intimidate them out of it all. The problem is there's something that's really missing in all those letters.
And that's called the law.
The law, and the law is firmly on the side. There's been no federal appellate court that has ever invalidated the national motto, and the Supreme Court of the United States has, I think now 2 or 3 times rejected appeals to do otherwise. So I'm pretty sure I know what's going to happen in the future when it comes to this motto.
Well, Keisha, if I can quote you here, it says that the motto should be honored and celebrated as an expression of what it means to be an American.
Yeah, that's right. And I think Sheriff Ivey's doing a great job of defending his decision to put the motto on the cars. It's the national motto. It's also the state motto in Florida. And FFRF's letter has no basis in the law at all. There's no case law. There's no legal, justification for their demand that Sheriff Ivey change his decision. And First Liberty sent a letter to the sheriff letting him know what the law actually is on the matter so he can make an informed decision, which is to ignore FFRF and to rip up the letter.
Yeah, ignoring is a good idea. And every time we've turned around, we find that they pretty much intimidate individuals because when they go to court, they lose. But if people don't know, they go, oh, I'm sorry, well, and we will pull that decal off, or we will no longer have this motto, or we will no longer use this particular statement, or we will no longer open in prayer, whatever it might be. And sometimes the best thing to do is simply to what? Ignore them.
Look, and if you get the letter and the best they can come up with is it's inappropriate, I mean, just throw it away.
Yeah.
I mean, if we've gotten to the point of it's inappropriate or not, there are concerns about your community and whatnot. We get all that, but it's perfectly legal. It's perfectly constitutional. Not only is it constitutional, it's absolutely appropriate.
Yes.
It is appropriate. Francis Scott Key himself said it was part of our national ethos back in the War of 1812 and all the way through to today. If it's the state and national mottos, how else can it be but appropriate to put on your cruisers?
Well, I encourage you to read the article, and you got quotes from Jeremy and Keisha, and also maybe you should pass it on to some of your law enforcement officials in your community. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, when the Apostle Paul made it to Athens, he was able to present the gospel to the Greek philosophers in a place known as the Areopagus. The Romans referred to it as Mars Hill. It was a place where various perspectives and ideas could be expressed, and today we call it the marketplace of ideas. Now, when I was in Athens, I was struck by the fact that you could see the Parthenon from this adjacent hill where Paul spoke to these philosophers about the unknown God. In fact, there's a plaque affixed to the hill that actually contains Paul's message in Greek for all to read and consider. Centuries later, John Milton gave a famous speech known as the Areopagitica, in which he defended the right of freedom of speech and expression. Those principles formed the basis for the modern justifications for free speech and marketplace, where various ideas can be expressed. The name of the speech was derived from the place where the Apostle Paul preached, as recorded in Acts 17. Following Milton were philosophers like John Locke and John Stuart Mill, who expressed the idea of a marketplace of ideas. They understood that truth could only be discovered if all views and opinions were considered. They rejected the idea of censoring viewpoints and banning topics and perspectives from an open, robust discussion. So why the brief history lesson? Well, I do so to remind us of the long and valuable tradition of a marketplace of ideas. That is not what you find on very many college campuses today. That is not what you find in some of the social media platforms. The academic elite and the media elite are quick to censor divergent views, especially Christian views. I think it is time for them to go back and learn the history of providing a marketplace of ideas. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to talk for just a few minutes about impeachment. We do want to mention it every day, but I recognize that eventually you're going to be impeached out eventually when we talk about it too often. But I thought, especially when I have two lawyers here, maybe we can talk about this process of impeachment. We posted one article about multiple articles of impeachment. I have yet, Jeremy, not seen anything that even comes close to high crimes and misdemeanors, but maybe you can help us out here on this whole impeachment issue.
You know, I was thinking about that this morning on my run too, going, what exactly is going on here? This quid pro quo, I guess there's a chance when a quid pro quo exists that it could be a high crime and misdemeanor. maybe we should look into the time that Joe Biden had a quid pro quo about his son there in Ukraine. Maybe that could be constituting something like that as well. I just don't know. But the reason we don't know and don't have a good sense of what we know or don't know is because first off, the party in power in the Congress has kept a lot of this from us so far.
Mm-hmm.
They're not allowing us to see a lot of things. They're doing a lot in secret. And until this past week, there weren't even articles of impeachment that are filed. Or there's not. I guess there aren't articles of impeachment still, right?
Not technically, no.
So all we're doing right now is we voted on a process that might lead to articles of impeachment.
Yeah. It's just to try to keep it in front of the American people.
And then half of these are still questionable things that are going on and held in secret. And then you have on top of all that, you've got these, quote, whistleblowers that are coming out. Well, their attorneys have a record on Twitter, at least, of saying, well, the coup has started right after the day after the inauguration, and quoting things from like what Hydra says in Captain America. Two will fall and one will fall and two will replace them or whatever. It's absurd things that they're saying here. And you've got this quote unquote whistleblower who has pictures with himself and Hillary Clinton and somebody else. I can't remember who the other guy was, but it was Biden or Bernie, one of the two. This is the same playbook from Lawrence Van Dyke to Kavanaugh. The only thing they can do on these things is try to impugn the character of whomever. The problem is that the president has not. He's prone to having this kind of stuff said about him, and it kind of sticks to the wall because he's kind of brash and hard, and he's not the most moral of human beings on the planet for sure. So it kind of sticks to him because he's kind of dirty and gross, it seems like, to people. So I actually don't have a position on the impeachment, whether it's successful or not or legitimate. I just don't know.
Yeah, it's really hard to follow. Even as a lawyer, you're still trying to figure out what's the legal basis for what's happening here. It's really hard to determine what the meat is and what's going on, whether this is just this man is despicable and we don't like him, or there's actually a crime that has taken place and they're trying to, investigate and see what's going on. It's very blurry.
Well, and again, due process, you can go all the way back to the Bible. Proverbs 18:17 says, the case for a man may seem legitimate until another person can, if you will, cross-examine him. I'm paraphrasing it a little bit. And up until now, you've never had a chance for people to say, wait a minute, I heard you say this, but that doesn't actually fit with this, or we don't have this in the transcript, and why are you saying that? And back to the point that Jeremy was pointing out, this came out many months ago, and I've kept it just because it's so much fun. 86 things Democrats have said Trump could be impeached for, starting back in February 1st, 2017.
Wow.
All the way. And you have to go all the way down to about 89 for, quote, extorting a foreign government. So they've had all sorts of, quote, reasons they thought the president could be impeached. But you get the sense that sometimes they're just making it all up.
Yeah, I mean, again, how else? We're supposed to trust that this is a legitimate process after they invented stuff about Kavanaugh and doxed people that were around him. And senators, for that matter, doing the same thing. We're supposed to trust that after what they've done to Lawrence Van Dyke and other people through that judicial confirmation process. They're just saying, hey, yeah, trust us. I know we're in a secret room down here, but it's because of national security. I mean, they're not even welcoming people that are qualified to be in the skiff with them hearing this information.
Right.
And they're certainly not even allowing them, according to reports anyway, they're not even allowed to ask questions of it's an entirely one-sided process. And even the vote that they took last week was one-sided. And there are a lot of people on the GOP side of the fence that have grave disagreement with this president, and they're still saying, no, this is not a legit process here. Look, if he's done something wrong, then bring it up. That's what they did back when President Clinton was impeached. I suspect that's what they did with the other presidents when they were impeached or leading to impeachment. Let's have a straight-up battle here. If you're so strongly believing that this is the issue, that Ukraine phone transcript is the issue, after Russia failed, after the DOJ scandals have failed, after blah, blah, blah have failed, all these other, we're down to 89 now, as you said?
Yeah.
If that's what it is, then, if you so strongly believe in that, man up, bring the articles of impeachment, and submit your evidence and let the people decide. The problem is the left doesn't think that the people should decide.
Yeah.
They believe themselves to be the grand authority in this country. They don't. They work for us. They need to bring us the information we need in order to govern ourselves. We'll make the decision at the ballot box one way or another.
You know, one of the things that I might just put on in terms of history is that if you look at the notes of the Constitutional Convention, and because I didn't go to law school but went to government school instead, they made us read the Federalist Papers and Constitutional Convention and the notes and all that. There was a time in which at first they thought maybe there could be an easier way to remove the executive individual, but that would look too much to them like a vote of no confidence in the parliament. And so that's why they raised the bar rather than lower it. And that's also why you have only had a few impeachment hearings in the history of this nation. Andrew Johnson, which I think was inappropriate. Richard Nixon, well, he resigned before we went through that. And then Bill Clinton. And, of course, now they're talking about it again. There was an understanding that if you really felt that there was somebody who was engaged in actual treason, then we need to remove them. Otherwise, you elect an individual every 4 years. You elect a Congress every 2 years. You elect Senate. Actually, back then we didn't elect senators every 6 years. They were put together by the Senate and the various states. That was the way, and that was the recourse. And here we're less than a year away. Couldn't you just simply say, no matter what you like, just wait, you know?
Yeah, if you believe it so badly, then find a better candidate than the 5,000 candidates that are running for the Democratic nomination right now. And now 5,001, we've got Michael Bloomberg. And how long before it's going to be 5,002 with Hillary Clinton that is kind of rumoring around the edges of things that she may or may not run? I think she's going to run. So, I mean, if you don't like this guy, cool, I get it. I understand. I had my disagreements with previous presidents, and I may even have disagreements with the current one. But I can exercise that right every 4 years to make sure that he gets out of there. And I can counteract him through my other votes every 1 or 2 years to make sure that the Congress is effectively restraining him on things. That's why we have a separate but equal, well-balanced government here, guys.
Yeah. Well, when we come back from the break, I want to talk a little bit about the campaign and get your comments about Elizabeth Warren, who seems to be at the most likely odds-on favorite, but also some of those various issues that are part of it. And one of the articles we've posted here is by Victor Davis Hanson on socialism, but also a new one that's come out even by Jarrett Stepman about the next generation of Americans will embrace socialism if we lose the war on history, in which he points out that some of the younger people, not Keisha, but some of the other younger people out there don't know their history. They don't know their Constitution like you do. So if nothing else, we'll get into that. And, of course, we have not done a very good job of encouraging your phone calls. So let me encourage you to do so. You can give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. You may have some comments about impeachment. You may have some comments about the campaign coming forward and the whole idea of socialism. A conversation we had earlier in the week with David Limbaugh. His new book really addresses that. Really, 3 of the chapters in his book are about socialism, because he and Jarrett Stepman write out that 70% of millennials say that they are likely or extremely likely to vote for a socialist. That's a pretty incredible number, and so we'll get into some of those conversations as well. But your action item for today is to simply go to pointofview.net, click on the button that says Take Action, Lawrence Van Dyke's confirmation. I know some of you have said, I've never called the Capitol Switchboard. This would be a good time to do so, and let your 2 senators know. Whether they are going to vote for him or against him, they need to hear from you. So take the time to go to our website. We'll come back and continue our conversation with Jeremy and Keisha right after these important messages.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, it is our weekend edition, and Jeremy Keisha in studio with us. And of course, we've already mentioned one of the articles where they're quoted from, but I thought we might also get into a couple of the other issues. And of course, why has socialism become popular? Also one by Jarrett Stepman today: next generation of Americans will embrace socialism if we lose the war on history. And it kind of brings us into the whole conversation of socialism, the whole conversation of what's happening right now in the Democrat Party. Let's take this one. The whole issue of Elizabeth Warren, the success of her, at least according to Dr. Merrill Matthews, fourfold, is that, number one, she is an individual that's very affable. If you've ever watched her in a campaign or watched her after a debate, she's taken selfies for hours, whereas Hillary Clinton would just take off the moment she would finish. She's in there with those people, sometimes the last person to walk out. Number two, if you wanted a socialist but you didn't want a socialist label, then she is your person, because Bernie Sanders is a socialist and isn't even necessarily a Democrat. So that's another issue that certainly is there. She also looks the most prepared. How many times have you heard her say, I have a plan for that? Got a plan for that. And then finally, of course, she still is sort of, quote, a minority, which I always have trouble saying when there are more women in the world.
She's 1/10/24th of a minority.
No, that's
I knew
not
I'd get that. But let's go around the table, because another person was saying that the reason she's won is because she's been able to appeal to the white liberals. And Beto O'Rourke did not do a very good job of that. Kamala Harris didn't either.
It's a sad day that he's gone.
And so now you're left with Elizabeth Warren. So talk us through a little bit, because this has been an interesting primary season before one vote has been taken place.
Well, look, I think in order to introduce this conversation, we really ought to have Sarah McLachlan playing in the background, I Will Remember You, as we remember the campaign that was Beto O'Rourke.
Okay.
I mean, that is like the equivalent of Taps to have that out on the way out here. Poor thing, Beto's gone. He was what a gift to radio shows across the country. Every day you had a chance to talk about something that was, what the left was actually thinking but too afraid to actually say. And so
we'll take your guns, we'll take your tax-exempt status, we'll take everything.
We'll take everything from you and just go away. We don't really need you, right? It's just incredible kind of stuff. I think Merrill did a good job with those explanations of where he's actually standing, why Warren is so popular. And it just kind of crystallized in my mind when you're going through that list. Yeah, those are really accurate, that she may be the sole person to have learned a few things, not everything, but a few things from the lesson of 2016. Where you had a very lackluster Democratic candidate who really gave the appearance, at least, of I am above you and I don't need you. And here you have someone who's actually really working hard, who is absolutely elitist in everything that she stands for, but gives at least the appearance of being a woman of the people.
Yeah. She definitely seems approachable, and I think that's really important, especially to millennials.
I don't think she actually has had a beer or enjoys it, but she would be someone that people say, I can
I'll
have a beer with her.
Yeah, and she definitely has a very approachable quality, and I think that's one of the reasons why she stands out. And like you said before, she's not labeled as a socialist. She's not as far on some of these issues as Beto, and so she seems to be the most appropriate, in some ways, candidate for those who are not willing to go as far on some of those issues that some of those other candidates were.
What about this? $52 trillion. That's a lot of money,
yes,
right? That's basically what we are talking about is $2 trillion a year in perpetuity. when the collections sometimes are a little over $3 trillion for the entire federal government. And then she wants to spend more than just that. So there are all sorts of lines that people use. Medicare Fantasy for All. I've got a plan for that. It's funded by rainbows and unicorns and all the rest. But this is one of the arguments that's being made in some of these articles, that at least she stood pat. Because as soon as Kamala Harris came out there and started backtracking on whether or not we would abolish private insurance, then it began to be a character issue. And that is, well, she's probably not going to stand up strong against Donald Trump. And so she lost her support. To her credit, whether you like it or not, Elizabeth Warren has said, you know what, I'm going to stand there. Here's one of the quotes. Elizabeth Warren pursued a much more consistent strategy than Harris or O'Rourke. Like Harris, she staked out a left-wing position early, but unlike Harris, she stuck to them. Even when she was attacked as being unrealistic or radical by lesser-known moderate candidates like John Delaney, she stuck back and actually struck back on those issues. She earned the support of her college-educated liberal base, not only by agreeing with them, but by being seen as fighting for them. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, I think that's the reason why she's so approachable and she appeals to that audience. I think she's found a niche, inside of this race that no other candidate has been able to find.
Well, and again, one of the things that I notice is that whether it's her or Joe Biden, or whether it's of course, we don't have Beto O'Rourke to kick around anymore. Jeremy's really upset about that. Or even Mayor Pete. I think you would all agree that if you are going to have to do what you do with an elected Pete or Warren or whatever, it's going to be a lot more difficult because they simply do not seem to have any appreciation for this idea of religious liberty.
Well, that's a really interesting one with Pete Buttigieg, because he should be everybody that the left says that they are. They should love him. Right? I mean, they should really, really like Pete Buttigieg. So why aren't they getting behind him? Is it because he's openly gay? I don't think so. That's one of the tenets of their platform, that you should welcome that in there. So that must be not it. Is he not economically liberal enough? I can't imagine that that's the case. He's got a very clear platform on what he would do and how he would spend it all. Could it be that he's actually invoking religion too much in his campaign?
And that was said on The View the other day. Not that I watch The View very often, but I
sure,
about it.
Kirby. Yeah, you try to play that off here, right?
But that was something some people were saying, I'm feeling just a little uneasy about all of this.
Yeah, but then, because he sort of appears, I think to those who don't like this idea of sort of the white patriarchy and, invoking your religious status and being married and this whole thing. And even though he sort of fits into some of these buckets that the left seems to like, there's still this air about him that seems very familiar in terms of his platform. Just, being a white male and being and preaching sort of this idea of religious tolerance, which is bogus, based on, his other comments about religion. But in any case, I think that's part of the reason why, is because the appearance, even though he fits into those buckets, he still sort of, I think, stands for a lot of the things that they don't like.
Yeah, that's right.
It's clearly a party that is very uncomfortable with religion in any fashion that it really comes out. Because, look, his religious beliefs, although he claims them to be rather orthodox, are not. And they're very... I think we could best categorize them as what would be mainstream Protestantism today, which is not very closely connected to the historic faith. And so I think the party itself, who are accustomed to using the pulpit in minority churches and whatnot to curry political favor, when they see people that actually seem to believe what they're saying, even if it's within the milquetoast denominations in which they're saying it, they get very nervous about that. And so we've said for years that the left is against any kind of religious display in public. It sort of seems to me like that's why Buttigieg is not getting the amount of traction that he maybe should be getting.
We might be like the American civil religion, but we don't want somebody really serious about it. And again, it brings us back to, since I'm the old guy around the table, could this Democratic Party ever even nominate a Jimmy Carter or even a Bill Clinton, who sang in the choir, at the Baptist church? We can talk about what that is. But when we come back, we're getting into a little more of those issues, because part of that is just the incredible interest in socialism. And who would have predicted, even a couple of years ago, but certainly a few decades ago, that a socialist candidate might necessarily be nominated by the Democrat Party? We'll talk about this right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, when the Apostle Paul made it to Athens, he was able to present the gospel to the Greek philosophers in a place known as the Areopagus. The Romans referred to it as Mars Hill. It was a place where various perspectives and ideas could be expressed, and today we call it the marketplace of ideas. Now, when I was in Athens, I was struck by the fact that you could see the Parthenon from this adjacent hill where Paul spoke to these philosophers about the unknown God. In fact, there's a plaque affixed to the hill that actually contains Paul's message in Greek for all to read and consider. Centuries later, John Milton gave a famous speech known as the Areopagitica, in which he defended the right of freedom of speech and expression. Those principles formed the basis for the modern justifications for free speech and marketplace, where various ideas and ideas can be expressed. The name of the speech was derived from the place where the Apostle Paul preached, as recorded in Acts 17. Following Milton were philosophers like John Locke and John Stuart Mill, who expressed the idea of a marketplace of ideas. They understood that truth could only be discovered if all views and opinions were considered. They rejected the idea of censoring viewpoints and banning topics and perspectives from an open, robust discussion. So why the brief history lesson? Well, I do so to remind us of the long and valuable tradition of a marketplace of ideas. That is not what you find on very many college campuses today. That is not what you find in some of the social media platforms. The academic elite and the media elite are quick to censor divergent views, especially Christian views. I think it is time for them to go back and learn the history of providing a marketplace of ideas. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, for just a minute, kind of look at a few of the issues, and I do mean a few of the issues that are front and center in the Democratic campaign. Medicare for all, of course, that is the big issue for Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, but Green New Deal, free college tuition, guaranteed basic income, living wage of $15 an hour, government daycare, that's another Elizabeth Warren one, and some others, forgive student loans, abolish ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Electoral College, voting age to 16. I always love when I say that, when Keisha always goes, oh, heavens, no. Yeah, then a couple more, pack the Supreme Court, reparations, comprehensive gun control, and that's not even the whole list. Are those winning issues in America? And that I could say that every one of those has been mentioned more than once in the Democratic debate.
Yeah, we're going to find out if they're winning issues. In the America that you and I grew up in, and even Keisha grew up in, who's so much younger than I am, she is. This is not the America that any of us grew up in. And yet we actually have a singular party who's not just talking about it, but those things that you just read off, they will be planks in their platform, regardless of who the nominee is. And so their goal is to accomplish those things throughout the process. So people, especially never Trumpers, that ask us, how can you dare support Trump? Well, that's why. Right there. I mean, if you got an alternative for me, I'm all ears. But right now I'm hearing two things. Really amazing judges and maybe some other drama along the side of it, or lose your guns, lose your nonprofit status, blah, 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 kill more kids in the womb, go on down the list of how awful that future looks like. That future leads to a breadline somewhere, and I don't want to be any part of it.
Yeah, good line. Keisha, what are your thoughts?
I think the the socialist aspects of some of the things she proposes, and a lot of these candidates propose, I think, are intended to appeal to the bleeding heart and the person that thinks that this is the way we're supposed to treat one another. But the uneducated bleeding heart, the voter who doesn't really understand the problems with those kinds of systems and what happens as a result of implementing a government that supports a lot of those plans.
You know, one of the things we talked about with David Limbaugh just the other day is the whole issue of why is socialism so popular. And one of the articles I posted is by Victor Davis Hanson. And if you think about this, it is amazing because he talks about Russia and China are still struggling. Eastern Europe still suffering decades after Soviet-imposed social chaos. How about Cuba, Nicaragua, North Korea, or Venezuela, just to mention a few, or even the pan-Arabic socialism that's devastated the Middle East, and maybe the soft socialism of European Union countries. You look at all that, and his arguments are, well, first of all, we have massive immigration. 60 million people in this country were foreign-born residents and their children. So in some respects, if you've come from a place where there has been an authoritarian control, maybe you're used to that. He talks about the fact that maybe there are progressive rich that are feeling guilty on Wall Street or Silicon Valley. But the third one I think is most significant. Universities, right? Just find me a university that fairly looks at the free market system and doesn't talk about socialism as a utopia. And then he adds to it something else that's kind of intriguing, and that is when you have 45 million borrowers, and some of us around the table can relate to student loan debt, can't we, of $1.6 trillion in collective student debt, maybe you think, well, the free market has failed me, and so socialism looks better. But if you are a student of history, you know that's not the answer, is it?
I had somebody, I can't remember now who it was, somebody the other day tell me that if you can crack the nut of higher education in the next couple of years, you stand to be a millionaire, right? And it's not continuing more of the same here that'll get you to be a millionaire, billionaire, whatever you're going to be. It's figuring out how to do this effectively and economically as well, because the current trajectory of higher education is simply not sustainable.
That's true.
It will run us deeply into debt individually, but then also corporately, because we're ultimately going to have to be the backstop on that. Everybody knows that big weight is coming on the American society at some point. It's going to pick up the tab for most people who have gone through higher education. We place such a prominence on higher education that the constant drumbeat for free college tuition is going to eventually get some traction at some level. And so that level of trying to figure that out is, so my point in saying all that is to say, in response to him, yes, the free market has not failed. The free market is actually presenting an opportunity for us to address the problem.
Right.
And so if you can actually crack that nut and figure out the solution, then by golly, you're gonna be able to make that $1 billion, and in retirement get so bored like Michael Bloomberg, you'll run for president.
Mm-hmm. But again, that's part of the problem that you have right now is a lot of people are going to say, it's like the reparations argument. Why should I be paying reparations to someone who was never in slavery, whose parents were not enslaved, whose grandparents were not enslaved? This is a similar kind of argument. Why should I, when I decided not to go to college, why should my taxes go to pay for people that decided to go to college and major in lesbian basket weaving? Is Ben Shapiro uses that all the time, or lesbian dance, I guess is the other one he uses all the time, or even go to law school where you guys both went and had to pay that, but you made those choices, and then all of a sudden somebody else that didn't go to law school, somebody else that is working at maybe a basic minimum wage job still has to pay taxes for that. That's a hard argument to begin to make, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, but I do think that the reason millennials especially are so attracted to that is because, well, number one, a lot of us are in a lot of debt from our education, but also sort of that concept, like I said, that we should be here to sort of, provide for one another and uplift the entire community and all of those, sort of buzzwords that a lot of the candidates use in order to appeal to the heartstrings of people who, like I said, who don't understand what happens when you create an entire system. That is based on the wealthy contributing to everyone else.
Well, again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I'd love to get your thoughts about some of these issues and whether or not you think those actually are winning issues. I'm not sure that they are, but nevertheless, they just seem to be a movement more and more. And it brings us back to the comment I made just a few minutes ago when we started the show. Michael Bloomberg The argument in the Associated Press article is that the reason people are even talking about this was the lead story today in Drudge. Why? I mean, well, because first of all, there are people that say the bloom is off the rose of Joe Biden. There's another one that, yeah, I think that's going to happen probably pretty quickly, and for a lot of different reasons. And then there is a fear that Elizabeth Warren is just not the person to run against Donald Trump. Now, I'm not so sure that you
but
want
I thought she
Michael...
had a plan to run against that. She's a plan. She's a plan, man.
She's a plan, man, and she's got a plan for everything. But Michael Bloomberg, as well as you mentioned Hillary Clinton, and of course we've heard all sorts of other suggestions as well, illustrate that even after this long process, recognize we have not cast one vote in a caucus or a primary. That's only 90 days away, though, so it's getting close. They're still talking about somebody like Michael Bloomberg coming in and having the money in order to make that work.
Mm-hmm.
Well, somebody at this point should have solidified the base. Somebody at this point. I mean, goodness sakes, it's split against, three different people still?
Yeah.
It's
almost
Warren,
equal.
Biden, and Sanders, I think, all at about 22 or thereabouts in the polling on things. So no horse is really pulling away from the crowd here. Bloomberg probably is just filled with enough hubris to think that he could actually be that horse to pull away. But I think that further splits the vote even further down the line. I mean, no other billionaires have fared very well in this campaign so far. There are at least two in the race. You can't name them because you don't remember hearing their names ever. And there are many others that have been seasoned politicians that have left, others that have nearly dethroned some of the most popular politicians in this country. They got all kinds of name recognition and 0% polling on things. So it's a tough nut for the Democrats to have to crack right now, but something should have solidified by this point and just has not. And you got to be really kind of, if you're Joe Biden, if you're Bernie Sanders, if you're Elizabeth Warren, you got to be kind of like, doggone it, what does it take? You know?
They're going to have to do better than this, is all I can say. If you want to beat Trump, you're just going to have to do better than this.
Let's come back to one other issue, and then we'll take some phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Democratic strategists really wanted to make sure that it was obvious that the Democratic Party was a diverse party. And so there was a real hope that Cory Booker or Kamala Harris or somebody, even Tulsi Gabbard, somebody would just be up there. But instead, you've got a couple of white men and one white woman, and the lead. And that is a frustration. And especially if there's something they did not want. They did not want a Bloomberg or a Joe Biden to have one rich guy debating another rich guy, one white rich guy debating another white rich guy. And Bloomberg is so close to Trump, at least in looks, even if not in ideology, very different in ideology. And that's just something that I think the so-called woke primary has not turned out the way that people expected it to.
Here we are in this race, and I'm sitting there going, I really like Tulsi Gabbard. That's where we're at now. She is left of me by a long way away from me, but
at least you can have a conversation with her.
She's almost relatable. She seems to be passably human.
And then, of course, she's being called a Russian spy.
Joy Behar, God bless you. Hillary, then Joy Behar went after her hard the other day on The View. I wasn't watching it. I saw Kirby's leftover tape from it.
Yeah, no, right. I'm going to catch that for a long time. We're going to go to a break, and I'm going to take some phone calls. We certainly have some comments, but I want to hear your comments. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I see some of you want to talk about socialism. Some of you want to talk about candidates. All fair game. We'll be right back.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MetaShare MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back for the final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to the state of New York first. Sylvia, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hello, Kerby and Company. I met you a couple of years ago up at Camp of the Woods, and I've been a pretty faithful listener since. So anyway, my comment is, today is the anniversary, or the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yes.
And guess what? Guess what the opinion was of those people that were taking down that wall? We have had enough of socialism. Let's try something better. And why human nature always heads for the low spots, I'll never know. But with the Lord, we get to follow the high ground. Where He leads, it's much better than anything else. So I think our problem with socialism is it's a spiritual problem. We'd rather be taken care of than be free.
I think so. And of course, there have some people, of course, on my article that I have, the little booklet on capitalism and socialism, I address, well, don't we have socialism in the New Testament? Well, of course, you had an economic decision to put things together, but socialism is actually implemented by the gun. And I think most people don't realize those. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because in the old studio, Marlon Maddox actually had a piece of the Berlin Wall, and sometimes we would touch it on the way into the studio. I need to figure out where. I need to see if we still got that around here somewhere. We'll put it in the studio again, because it's a reminder of that there were a lot of people on the other side of that wall wanting to have freedom. And now we have a lot of people that have freedom that, in a sense,
want to go the other way.
They want to put them on the other side of the wall.
Mm-hmm. I mean, how foolish.
Yeah.
We're just plain foolish.
Well, I'll be up at Camp of the Woods. I'll be up at Word of Life this, I think, July, and then I'll be at Camp of the Woods in September, so maybe we'll have a chance to say hello to you. But she's got a good point. 30th anniversary of the Berlin Wall, and I'm old enough to remember that.
Hard to improve on what Sylvia said there. I mean, this is an incredible day, one that is terribly not remembered well. It should be remembered better. I mean, those crucial words that no one wanted the president to say, but led to this day. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Yeah. How remarkable it is that these many years later now, we're sitting there with people who wanted to get out of a country, but the government wouldn't let them out. Think of how grateful we must be in this country that people want to get in so badly. And let that be a lesson to the rest of the nations of the world, that maybe you ought to look at your country and what you're doing there. This idea of freedom that you say you profess but actually don't provide to your people. Why are so many of your people leaving and that they're coming here? That is a good thing that they want to come here. I hope we can accommodate them somehow.
30th anniversary. That's, of course, 30 years ago, probably you weren't watching that the way we were, as a little bit older around the table. But that gets back to the issue for the younger generation. That's just something in the history books, and you've never seen what it was like when Marlon Maddox used to get this program on shortwave, so that people in radio-free Europe could actually hear this broadcast, because they didn't have the freedom like we have now because of the internet.
Yeah, and I actually was around when that was happening. I'm not that young. But,
we're giving you a lot of credit.
Yeah, I think I'll just say that, I think it's a lesson to everyone now, particularly millennials who are embracing socialism, to understand that if they're so, concerned with choices, they need to understand that eventually socialism will remove all your choices. And you will be completely, restricted in your access. So I think that's an important lesson.
Yeah, so look at your history, is what you're saying, right? Look at the history that is behind you, and don't forget these things, or Lord Acton becomes accurate, right? We're doomed to repeat if we don't understand what our history actually was.
Yeah. Well, again, this book that we were talking about with certainly David Limbaugh is one. This article by Victor Davis Hanson might be one to pass on. And then another one I'm just quoting from the new book, The War on History. Maybe we'll get Jared Steppman on in the future, because it gets back to knowing your history, and that is certainly relevant. So, again, Sylvia, thank you for that. Let's head to South Carolina this time. Dory, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm surprised I got on. I know you only have a couple of minutes, but while I'm a bit of a conservative, I'm also a bit of a deep thinker, and I have friends that are lesbian and gay people who are intensely conservative on every level, and I think that the choices that we make go a little bit beyond sexual preference, number one. That's not really what we're talking about here. I don't think, personally.
Sure. Well, I appreciate you bringing that up, because, some people will say, well, you know, this whole religious liberty thing is sort of anti-LGBTQ. And actually, the example I use, and see if you guys around the table agree or not, because we have this one T-shirt manufacturer. He makes T-shirts in Kentucky, and so far he's kind of won his cases as he's gone along. But one of the people that actually filed a kind of a friend of the court brief was a lesbian T-shirt producer in New Jersey, and said, you know, wait a minute. First of all, it's unfair for you to criticize him because in many cases he's rejected other T-shirts, like one that showed Jesus with a bucket of chicken. He thought that was kind of ridiculous. And he rejects T-shirts that celebrated divorce and things like that. But she was saying, wait a minute. This religious liberty thing, even though I'm not really very Christian, is really important, because if you could force him to actually make a T-shirt that celebrates gay pride, then that same government could force me to make a T-shirt that would be against my sensibilities. So sometimes my argument is religious liberty is something you should support even if you're not a Christian. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. It's fair. And I think people don't realize that the First Amendment protects everyone, no matter if you're religious or not. And I think it's really important for people to understand that regardless of whether you agree with the viewpoint of the person in the case or the religious observer in the particular situation, that you could very well be in the situation where the government is trying to compel you to do something that is against your conscience.
You know, the speech that was given the other day by the Attorney General of the United States, Bill Barr, at Notre Dame is one that I have a commentary coming out on. And he was just basically saying that we all need to come back and recognize the value of religious liberty, because he says the real test that the founders had was whether or not in a free society we could maintain moral discipline and virtue. And his argument is really the only place you can find where you maintain virtue and moral discipline is in religion. And he goes on and says that if we reject these ideas of religious liberty, this is the Attorney General of the United States, which I still think is pretty amazing. He said that. Then we either end up with one of two alternatives, either unbridled pursuit of personal appetites at the expense of common good. To paraphrase the Old Testament, everyone does what they think is right in their own eyes. And you just have total moral anarchy. And that can't happen very long. Or else then the other alternative is for a coercive government to impose restraints.
That's right.
And frankly, you cannot put enough police officers on every corner if you don't have civil government and you don't have self-government taking place. So I've said before, I don't care if you're an atheist, a Christian, a Buddhist, a Hindu, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, whatever it might be. You really need religious liberty, don't you?
Yeah, and I think the president made a really good point when he was addressing the UN and he talked about religious liberty. He said, what was it, 80% of the world does not have any religious freedom? And there's a reason for that. It's because it's a very difficult freedom to keep. You have to be committed to it, even if you don't agree with the person who you're protecting. And that's the only way we're going to be able to keep it in America.
That's a great line that just needs to be written down and put on our brochures. That was a great line, Keisha. Yeah, look, our president, Kelly Shackelford, is fond of saying that that the left can have no competitor to their power. And for those who want to insert this kind of socialist idea and autocracy like that, they can have no competitor to their own power. And that's why they hate religious liberty so much, because it permits and frankly assumes that there is a higher power, that to them they must even submit. And they hate that idea, and so they will drive religion and the God behind that religion out of the public square, because they can't have the ultimate power if he actually does in fact exist. So thankfully our country, as he's also quick to point out, was founded on this very idea that our rights were given to us not by government, they were given to us by God. And therefore, we are duty-bound to make sure that they are preserved. We can't give them up to, we can't give them as a government to people. They are given to us out of creation. And therefore, they belong to us. And it's the government's job to therefore protect those things. And when they fail to do that, it is right and proper for us to rise against them and say, no, you're not permitted to do that. And that's why we exist at First Liberty, to make sure that people's First Amendment freedoms, those religious liberty rights that we hold so precious and so foundational to our country, are preserved on and into the future.
You're here.
Yeah. And Kelly said he's had people come up to him, as have come up to me, saying, look, I'm an atheist, but you know what? If you guys lose your rights, sooner or later I lose my rights.
That's right.
And I thought, well, that's pretty profound.
That's at least intellectually honest on things.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so, again, I recognize that sometimes people might say, well, these religious people or religious liberty is really hurting the LGBT community. Well, you're going to have a lot more freedom under those that believe that everyone is created in the image of God. All of them have value and dignity. Sounds like Lawrence Van Dyke. Does that sound right?
It sounds familiar.
Sounds familiar. Let's take a break. We'll come back and have some final comments, including we're going to talk a little bit about what's on the First Liberty website. If you haven't gotten your Constitution and Declaration, that's there. And if you'd like to know more about what they're doing, we'll talk about that right after this.
The Little Sisters of the Poor, a religious order that serves the elderly and impoverished, were again in court recently asking for protection from the Obamacare mandate that tells them they must include contraceptive coverage in their employee health plan. In 2017, the Department of Health and Human Services, plus the Labor and Treasury departments, adopted rules which allowed exceptions to Obamacare's mandate that employers provide birth control to their employees as part of their health coverage. Many Christian organizations need this religious exemption, including the Little Sisters, because they are, well, nuns. A panel for the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled 2-1 against this exemption, with Judge J. Clifford Wallace writing for the majority that it, quote, contradicts congressional intent. Congressional intent? That nuns get free contraception? Senior Circuit Judge Andrew Kleinfeld pointed out in his dissent that, quote, no affidavits have been submitted from any woman establishing any question in this case about whether they will be deprived of reproductive services or harmed in any way by the modification of the regulation. The Little Sisters have been to the Supreme Court about this before. In 2016, the High Court granted the Little Sisters a religious exemption from Obamacare's contraceptive mandate. 1 year later, President Trump issued his executive order requiring that HHS exempt the Little Sisters and other religious ministries. Several states challenged this. The California Attorney General argued that the exception allows employers to use religious beliefs to discriminate against employees. The Wall Street Journal's Peggy Noonan wrote of the good religious charities like the Little Sisters do for the poor in society. She expressed her hope that this time the Supreme Court will, please God, affirm with clarity and force the constitutional rights without which they cannot exist. Oh, progressives, she wrote, if you only had the wisdom to back off, to see your demands as the opposite of live and let live. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and we are privileged to have in studio with us Jeremy and Keisha. And Keisha, I want to come to you for just a minute, because anybody that listens online, and quite a number of people do, or they listen later on and download it, they will have heard the commentary by Penna Dexter, Little Sisters Battle. Now, there are probably a good number of individuals listening to this saying, now, wait a minute, I thought we solved the Little Sisters of the Poor and Hobby Lobby. I know you filed a brief on that issue. So, first of all, remind us what the issue is and why in the world are we talking about them again?
Yeah, why is this still happening? Okay, so what's going on is that, as you all know, the Obama administration gave an accommodation to some of the other religious organizations that were not included in the exemption. And many of those religious organizations say that even the accommodation makes them complicit in offering contraception. And so you have this decision that came out of the Third Circuit, which is the one that's going up to the Supreme Court. Another one came out of the Ninth Circuit last week, or I think the week before that. But essentially what's going on here is the Third Circuit really challenges whether the accommodation does, in fact, make these religious organizations complicit. Now, if you know anything about the way religious liberty is supposed to be analyzed by the courts, the Third Circuit makes a grave mistake by analyzing the reasonableness of the religious belief, which is a no-no. Okay, and so they do that, and then they also say that the Trump administration does not have the right to issue a broad religious exemption in order to finally put this all to bed. The Trump administration said, look, if you have a religious or moral objection to either the accommodation process or the contraceptive mandate, we'll exempt you. And these states, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, have stepped in and said, we don't want you to do that. We don't think you're allowed to do it. And because we don't want to pay for this birth control that we think is so utterly important, we don't think you should exempt anyone. And so the Third Circuit did exactly that and said the exemption to the accommodation process was improper, and definitely granted disparate deference to the Trump administration, because no one questioned whether the Obama administration had the authority to make these exemptions. But now all of a sudden, because Trump is president, now it's a problem.
Yes, and I've always said that for a lot of people, there's sauce for the liberal goose, but not for the conservative gander.
That's right.
And we found that out to be the case, even in this particular case, the Little Sisters of the Poor.
Well, they just won't let it go.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think most Americans get the fact that the left just will not let this issue go. It is a sacrament to the left here that they must push this thing forward and force you and me, regardless of your religious convictions, to make sure that you are doing everything you can to, whether you want to or not, to make sure contraceptives and abortifacients are making their way into the hands of people that need them. I don't care if you're an 80-year-old celibate nun, you still have to provide this as a part of your plan.
That's right.
I mean, it doesn't pass the smell test, let alone the logical test,
right.
and certainly not the political test either. And I believe at the end of the day, it will not pass the legal test either.
Yes.
And let me just say that there's really no justification for any of this, because there are many entities that are grandfathered out of providing contraception that don't have any religious exemptions at all. And so there's already millions of women that are not covered by the contraceptive mandate. And so you have to ask yourself, what is the problem with exempting other organizations from this mandate? And the point, it seems, is really just to compel these organizations to violate their religious convictions in full view of the world.
And I'm confused. I thought that was the reason why we needed to keep Planned Parenthood around.
Yeah.
They're the ones that were singularly holding out this promise of contraceptions being uniformly and economically available to everyone, even those in the far-flung hinterlands of this country, as we've been told.
You know, the other aspect of this, back to the millennials that we talked about on Tuesday, is that originally the people that were really in favor of a lot of the LGBT advances were the younger generation, because it was sort of a justice issue. You know, I may not be same-sex attracted, but why should I tell somebody who wants to get married to somebody of the same sex they can't get married? But as soon as that happened, then it reversed, and now you're starting to see, whether it's on same-sex marriage, whether it's on this issue of abortion, now it isn't just enough that we'll have a live and let live philosophy.
That's right.
But instead saying you now have to, and fill in the blank. So in other words, you have to actually accept same-sex marriage, or we'll pull your tax-exempt status. You have to provide contraceptive mandate, or we will punish you. And even if you're the Little Sisters of the Poor,
even if you're nuns that have been serving the poor since the 1800s, you still need to provide this.
And I think that's why all of a sudden this generation's starting to say, wait a minute, you know, you won me over with the equal sign on the bumper sticker. You won me over with the word equality. That worked. And then all of a sudden I realized they're just more bullies than anybody I would have ever imagined. This sort of authoritarian element here is really starting to backlash, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it definitely is becoming obvious that this is not about equality, it's about compulsion. And that you have to not only allow and let live, but you must also voice and profess your allegiance to these ideas. Otherwise, we will destroy you.
Didn't see that one coming. We have a link to First Liberty. When you go there, first of all, you can actually get a copy of the Declaration and the Constitution. I think that's a really wonderful opportunity. The other night, I was with Colonel Allen West, who sometimes sits in this chair, and he was talking about, somebody was saying, you know, when he was member of Congress, you know, you're talking about all these religious ideas, and that's that's a violation of the separation of church and state. So he pulls out his pocket constitution, hands it to one of these students. So can you show me where you find those words? And of course, you can't find it as well. So that's one of those ideas. But we also talked about In God We Trust. Don't you still make available those window clings if somebody wants to have In
I'm
God
sure
we
we
trust?
can find some there somehow.
Yeah, so
We've
that's
got
another
some,
one.
yeah.
And most importantly, we just talked about a minute ago, Jeremy, the fact that, we lose our rights if we don't stand up for our rights. So there's sections on school, military, houses of worship, community. You would love to have some people remind you of some letter or tell you about some letter that the Freedom from Religion Foundation has filed so that you can get involved in one of those cases, wouldn't you?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I had a situation this week, as a matter of fact, where someone consulted one of those resources and called me and said, I don't know if I'm still doing this right or that they're doing it right or wrong or what have you. Can you help me out? And I think it's going to turn into a case. So it's important for you to have these things, as I've told moms and dads. Print those resources out, put them in your Trapper Keeper, your kid's Trapper Keeper or backpack or whatever the kids are using these days to organize themselves on the way to school, so that they know when something has gone crossways here. Our goal is to make sure that they have the freedom to be people of faith wherever they find themselves, in the public square, the military, houses of worship, in the schools. We want you to have the freedom that the First Amendment promised you so many years ago to freely exercise your faith. And you need to be reminded, and this is why you listen to Point of View to get this information too, that if the government has overstepped its lawful, legitimate role in providing the limited government that we have authorized as citizens for them to perform, it is right and proper for the people who own the government to check them and say, I'm sorry, you have exceeded your rational bounds. You need to return back to your sphere of sovereignty and allow us to continue to operate within ours.
Yeah.
And so it's good for us to do that. And if we don't do that, government will grow like a goldfish. They will fill whatever size pond they're put into until you have to build a bigger pond.
Be careful the king that you ask for.
That is for sure. And I'm just thinking that one of the people that told you about the POW-MIA Remembrance Table case was a listener to Point of View.
I didn't know that. No kidding.
Yeah,
That's great.
And so I think we found that out from Michael Berry, that actually, so some of you right now maybe have actually surfaced some of these cases. And so if you can surface some more, I'm sure these two lawyers would love to get
Please
involved.
do. Go to firstliberty.org. And as my testimony is that, look, if you listen to the show long enough, you might actually become one of us.
Yes. And we've used that story more than once, if you listening out there in the van while you're waiting for your sister to finish her lesson. So if nothing else, Keisha, thank you for being here. Thank you for the great material that you've added to that. Jeremy, thank you as well. And if you'd like to see some of the articles where they're quoted, we have those on our website today, things about Trump and the judges. Matter of fact, there's a great video that was actually taped of Kelly after he came out of that meeting. So you can find that there. Articles of impeachment, socialism, as well as In God We Trust. So many great articles that we have posted there for you, and you need to pass them on to others so that they'll know how to stand up for their religious liberty as well. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. I'm looking forward to a really good week next week here on Point of View. So enjoy the week and join us on Monday right here on Point of View.
So when people first hear about Metashare, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, Metashare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become Metashare members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With Metashare, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.